Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time wherever you are. I'm Michael Ryder. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, and I am delighted to be welcoming you today to the first of the 2 days of our conference on US policy towards Asia in President Trump's second term. It's a pleasure particularly to welcome all of the 24 moderators and speakers, outstanding scholars in their own fields, both today and tomorrow. It's a particular privilege to be hosting this 2-day conference in collaboration with two other outstanding organizations, the International Institute for Asian Affairs, who will be online with us today and speaking to you tomorrow, and with the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office Association, represented by Edward Glover, who will be making some introductory remarks of his own in a few minutes. These two entities represent two different aspects of expertise in Asia. The IAS is a scholarly organization. The FCDOA is full of people who have spent their professional lives in and around Asia in a highly practical manner. So I hope in the course of the discussions, we'll see reflections of both of those perspectives emerging. For those who are not familiar with the Royal Society for Asian Affairs, the organization was founded originally in 1901 and has been in existence ever since. And if you're curious about what we do, I would encourage you to visit our website and ideally, of course, to join the society, but perhaps if you don't want to go that far, just to subscribe to our newsletter. There are all kinds of amazing benefits from being members of the RSAA, including our journal, Asian Affairs. So do consider it. We also now host the Asian Review of Books, which is the only online review site devoted exclusively to Asia. And it is completely free. And if you are interested in this field, not just in terms of international politics and current affairs, but in terms of literature as well, I hope you'd find that a very valuable resource. Today's focus is going to be on India, China, and Central Asia, and tomorrow we'll deal with the Middle East, the Far East, and Southeast Asia. And I'm going to leave it there, but I invite Edward, a former colleague of many years standing of my own, to introduce the FCDOA and its important role in taking forward today's event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. And for those who are unfamiliar with the FCDOA, it was formed in 1999. Throughout the period since then, it has been based in the Foreign Office in London, and our membership is primarily those who have worked in the Foreign Office but who left to do other things, but also a proportion of current members of staff. It's a great pleasure to join Michael in opening this first session. The RSAA and the FCDOA have much in common, a shared interest in promoting greater knowledge in the sphere of diplomacy and securing greater recognition of the art of diplomacy. At this time of increasing uncertainty and destabilization and profound changes in geopolitical relationships, it's all the more reason to have greater understanding of the factors at play. And to do that, we have, and it's my long-held opinion, to step back, to take a longer view. What has brought us to where we are? What can we learn from the past? And how best, against a historical backdrop, to approach the future. In my view, it requires imaginative thinking, mitigating action, adapting in the process to new circumstances, and finding opportunities to innovate new ideas and policies. And Asia is a good place to start, hence today's important topic. I would just conclude by saying that in 2018, at a Foreign Office staff event I organized, Peter Frankopan, all well known to you all, said that Asia was, in his opinion, the center, and always had been, of global history. He added that Alexander the Great had recognized this and turned east, but the Romans had got it wrong and went west. So let's follow Alexander the Great's example and turn east, and let's begin. Thank you very much.
As the United States redefines its role under a second Trump administration, South Asia stands as a pivotal arena for balancing strategic stability and economic growth. India remains a cornerstone of Washington's Indo-Pacific vision, an essential partner in countering Chinese influence and promoting open markets. Yet the region's persistent volatility, from Afghanistan's uncertain trajectory to Pakistan's internal fragility, continues to test US diplomacy. American engagement must navigate competing imperatives, deepening ties with New Delhi, managing tense relations with Islamabad, and addressing humanitarian and governance challenges across the broader region. This panel will examine how Trump's foreign policy, marked by transactional realism and renewed emphasis on security partnerships, may shape US relations with South Asia. It will also explore the prospects for regional stability, development cooperation, and the evolving strategic architecture that will define the region's next chapter. Moderating this first panel, we have Dr. Kamran Bokhari. Dr. Bokhari is a senior director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington, D.C., and teaches a graduate course on Central Asia and Eurasian geopolitics at Georgetown University. He also serves as National Security and Foreign Policy Specialist at the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute, and is the author of Political Islam in the Age of Democratization. In the second half of this panel, there'll be time for questions from the audience, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Kamran.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, RSAA, for organizing this and for inviting me. Thank you to the panelists, Michael, Dinaker, and Akriti, for joining us. I'm just going to go quickly introduce our panelists, say a few words about the broader strategic environment of the world, and then I'm going to go one by one and allow our panelists to share their preliminary thoughts. And after that, we'll just continue with the Q&A, and hopefully we'll get questions from the gallery, and we'll be happy to address that. So, okay, so what we have here is a really good panel. We have Michael Kugelman, who's an expert and longtime analyst of South Asia. Until recently, he was a director of the South Asia Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And he is a prominent voice as far as U.S. foreign policy towards South Asia is concerned. He's joining us today or tonight from Islamabad in Pakistan. Next, we have Akriti Kalyankar, who is a fellow with the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. Her research focuses on U.S.-China-India strategic dynamics, the geopolitics of Southern Asia, U.S.-India defense and strategic cooperation, and Indian foreign policy. She's also the editor of South Asia's South Asian Voices, and an online magazine on security and politics. Last but not least, we have Dinaker Peri, who is a fellow on security studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in India. He was previously a journalist with the Hindu newspaper for 11 years, covering defense and strategic affairs. Welcome, everybody. Okay, so Charlie sort of set the stage for what's happening in South Asia and how very broadly how the United States is looking at it. I just want to sort of widen the aperture, widen the lens, and place our conversation in a broader context. So this does not need a reminder, but it's worth pointing out that U.S. foreign policy towards South Asia is not devoid of what is happening around South Asia. So there are attempts to bring the conflicts in Middle East to an end, which are pulling South Asian actors, particularly Pakistan, into the Middle East. We have had a understanding, if I can call it that, between the presidents of the United States and China recently in a summit meeting in South Korea. And so there seems to be some sort of an understanding in the making. I say that very cautiously, between Washington and Beijing on a whole host of issues, particularly global trade. And then there is sort of this continuing conflict in Ukraine, which is now approaching its fourth year. And that also has connections to South Asia, given India's relationship with Russia and the United States imposing tariffs, and so on and so forth. Lastly, I want to point out that there seems to be a strategy emerging from the Trump White House. It basically revolves around the idea that the United States will no longer do the heavy lifting for security around the world, and instead will reach out to allies and partner nations in different parts of the world to take the lead in managing security in their respective regions, and the United States playing a secondary role. We see this emerging in the Western Pacific. We see this emerging in the Middle East. We're trying to see this emerge in Europe and with Russia. But it's very new and raw in South Asia, especially given the 87-hour war back in May between India and Pakistan. I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to hand the mic over to Michael to get his preliminary thoughts, and then we're going to go through the entire panel. Michael, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kamran, and thank you to the to RSAA for including me in this discussion. It's a really timely one to have. So I've been asked to speak briefly about the Trump administration's approaches to Pakistan and also Afghanistan. And I emphasize the word approaches because, in my view, there is not yet a formal policy that I'm aware of toward these two countries. And then I'll offer just a bit of broader context about what I say. So starting with Pakistan, I'd argue we're seeing a very different approach from what we had seen over the last few decades. The administration, the Trump administration, is applying a largely commercial lens to Pakistan, looking at it through business opportunities, the same types of business opportunities it seeks abroad on the whole, investment opportunities. So, critical minerals, energy, crypto, these are priorities for the administration in Pakistan right now, as they are in the world on the whole. Previously, U.S. approaches to Pakistan tended to be largely security focused, related to counterterrorism concerns and issues related to the war in Afghanistan, which of course ended several years ago. There is still a counterterrorism focus for the Trump administration when it comes to Pakistan. It views Pakistan, or it appears to view Pakistan, as a helpful partner when it comes to tracking down Islamic State Khorasan terrorists that have threatened or targeted Americans. And in fact, many of you will remember that it was a joint operation between the U.S. and Pakistan that apprehended an ISK terrorist soon after the administration took office that prompted the president to thank Pakistan in his first joint address to Congress. And I'd argue that that shout out from Trump really set the tone for the more positive and friendly approach that the Trump administration has taken to Pakistan compared to what we've seen over the last few years and really over the last few decades. There also are some indications that the Trump administration sees Pakistan as having strategic significance, given current developments in the Middle East and the close relations that Pakistan has with key players there. And Kamran alluded to this earlier. Recently, Marco Rubio said that he wants to explore strategic partnership, or the possibilities for strategic partnership with Pakistan. This is very different, again, from what we've seen in recent years, especially the Afghanistan war years, when U.S. approaches to Pakistan were security focused and also transactional. You rarely heard U.S. officials talking about Pakistan as a strategic partner. Shifting to Afghanistan, here I'd argue it's very simple. The chief objective of the Trump administration is to secure the freedom of the remaining U.S. citizens being held in Taliban captivity. It's really the only goal, as I understand it, and it's important for the administration, so important that the U.S. hostage envoy has gone to Kabul twice this year, since the administration took office, to work on negotiations. First time a U.S. official has set foot on Afghan soil since the Taliban returned to power, and this has happened twice. Otherwise, the Trump administration, in my view, does not think that much about Afghanistan on policy levels, on strategic levels. The lack of recognition of the Taliban government, of course, is a big reason why engagement is necessarily limited. There are terrorism concerns for sure, especially given the growing global threat posed by ISK, which is mainly based in Afghanistan. But here, I think there are two factors that could reduce the scope or the possibilities for U.S. engagement on this issue. One is that the Trump administration, like the Biden administration, acknowledges the Taliban as an indirect counterterrorism partner simply because the Taliban are actively fighting ISK. Unlike most of the Islamist militant groups in Afghanistan, ISK is a rival of the Taliban's. And also, the U.S. really does appear to be looking to Pakistan to help the U.S. Go after those ISK terrorists on Pakistani soil that are threats to the U.S. I don't place that much stock in the other things that the president has sometimes said about Afghanistan, demanding that Taliban return American weapons, demanding that the U.S. be given back Bagram Air Base. These are not serious demands in my view, and at any rate, I think they're complete non-starters, and happy to discuss why. So to conclude, just a few caveats and broader context. First, so far as I understand, there has not been a formal policy review toward Pakistan or Afghanistan or South Asia on the whole since Trump won. And one would argue that during the Biden administration, South Asia really became eclipsed by this idea of the Indo-Pacific, which one could argue is also is in question itself now. At any rate, there has not been a formal South Asia policy or Afghanistan policy since the first Trump administration. Trump announced that South Asia policy in 2017. That was a very different type of policy, the one back then. It took a hard line on Pakistan and it continued, albeit for a short-lived period, the U.S. Presence in Afghanistan. So what we have now is very different, but also not very clearly defined, not a formal policy. Second point I'll make, there's no more Afghanistan-Pakistan hyphenation. So during the Afghanistan war years, U.S. policy toward Afghanistan was largely viewed through the lens of Afghanistan. That's not happening now. It's actually quite promising, I think, that U.S. approaches to Pakistan these days are viewed through the lens of Pakistan, which is as it should be in any bilateral relationship. You don't want a bilateral relationship to be seen through the prism of a third country. And this dehyphenation, which really set in after the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan 4 years ago, is important because the hyphenation had affected everything from U.S. policy to bureaucracy. You had government offices and even individual positions like the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan that glommed together both countries, and neither country liked that hyphenation at all. Final point, and this mainly applies to Pakistan, it's important not to overstate what's happening now because it could easily change next week, next month, next year. Pakistan, I'd argue, is a flavor of the month in Washington these days, in great part, because Pakistan has successfully pitched itself to the Trump administration, both as a helpful partner in capitalizing on commercial opportunities in Pakistan and as an impactful, meaningful player in the Middle East scenario. There's been a lot of high-level bilateral engagement between the U.S. and Pakistan, a lot of aspirational talk about possible partnerships and collaborations, but there's been very little actual cooperation between the two sides, aside from some CT activities, but even that's been limited. More importantly, as we all know, the president is unpredictable. He could get frustrated with Pakistan if he sees the challenges of trying to capitalize on commercial opportunities. And if things were to calm down in the Middle East, which would be a really good thing, that could lead to a situation where the administration might accord less strategic utility to Pakistan. So, this U.S.-Pakistan honeymoon or reset or whatever you want to call it, it may not last that long. So I'll conclude there. Back to you, Kamran.
Thank you so much, Michael. So in order to connect what's happening in Afghanistan, and I want to go to Akriti, and I want to bring her to talk about the India-Afghanistan relationship that recently seems to be flowering, especially with the visit of the Taliban foreign minister on a 6-day visit to New Delhi and other places, particularly Deoband, where the madrasa, the founding madrasa of the Deobandi school is housed and has been housed dating back to the days of the British. So what can you tell us, Akriti, on how India is viewing the shift in Washington towards Pakistan and Pakistan's problems with Afghanistan. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Kamran and Charlie and the other organizers for having me. So I'll speak a bit about the India-Afghanistan-Pakistan trilateral, but I believe I was asked to focus more on the U.S.-India relationship and sort of implications of that for India's foreign policy. So let me just say, maybe first starting out with the question that you asked, Kamran. I think this, India, Taliban sort of re-engagement or rapprochement, I think this is actually focused on very sort of realist, pragmatic thinking in New Delhi. The idea is that, we've seen the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. India wants to, have, presence in terms of intelligence input, in terms of having a handle on its own security environment in the region. It wants to have, there's a recognition in Delhi over the last few years that the Taliban is here to stay, even though, it is an actor that has targeted India directly, whether it's through consular attacks in Afghanistan or, just sort of the extreme views on the religious side that the Taliban have had vis-a-vis India, or particularly towards, the BJP or the religion. So there's a very kind of realpolitik thinking here in Delhi about how to approach the relationship with the Taliban. The sense is, India invested a lot in Afghanistan, starting from 2000 2001. There's from 3 to 4 billion of aid that India's poured into Afghanistan. It's built the parliament building. It's focused a lot on the humanitarian side of that relationship, and so this is about sort of preserving the gains that India made in the relationship with Afghanistan, but also making sure that it's present in its own region. In some ways, the conversation on Afghanistan's future in probably the 2015 to 2020 period left out India in many meaningful ways. It was very focused on the US, Pakistan, China, other actors in the region dictating sort of the outcomes of the future of the country. And so this is also India's way of being sort of directly involved in making sure that there is stability in its environment. And I do think that some of this is driven by the tensions in the Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship. Even though this kind of reset that we're seeing, or not reset, but engagement that we're seeing precedes the current tensions in the Pakistan-Afghanistan relationship, right? We've actually seen some of these moves from India towards engaging with the Taliban since maybe sort of 2021, 2022 onwards. But the fact that you now have a fairly adversarial relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan does provide that strategic ballast or, logic to this relationship that we probably haven't seen in many years, just because of the alignment between Pakistan and Afghanistan. So let me turn a little bit to the US-India relationship as well, and how some of that sort of Washington factor plays into Indian calculations. And I wanted to touch on, we've seen a lot starting from Prime Minister Modi was one of the first foreign leaders that President Trump hosted in the White House after coming back to power. And we have seen a pretty dramatic shift in the way that India is perceived in Washington. If you just look at the imposition of tariffs, right? If you look at the trade side of things, from February, having that joint statement and having a pretty forward-looking view of the US-India relationship, to now where we are at 50% tariffs on India, no sort of conclusion on the trade deal. But I think there are, three aspects or three building blocks of the US-India relationship from which we need to sort of evaluate and assess what is going on in the relationship and what is it going to mean for the future direction of these ties. So for me, I think the relationship will survive, but with some deep scars. And I think there are some questions that both sides are going to need to answer that will decide the future direction of the relationship. In terms of, what I see as sort of the three building blocks of the US-India relationship, the first is the US sort of supporting India's rise as a net security provider, as a leader in South Asia, and building India's material capability, whether that's on defense or technology. And I think most of that has actually survived in the last few months. We see that India-US cooperation has become, in some ways, so institutional and structural that it's hard to put a brake on it. We've seen that what is anchoring the relationship right now is linkages at the bureaucratic and private sector level. So, you've seen that the US-India 2+2 intersessional dialogue happened in August. You've seen the US-India Trust meetings, which is focused on technology sharing, happen in mid-September. You've seen the Quad functional meetings happen the last few months. And the latest is that you've seen a renewal of the US-India Defense Framework Agreement on October 31st. Military exercises have also continued. The UWS, which is the US and Indian Army's joint exercise, happened in Alaska in September. And I think most interestingly for me is that engagement between the private sectors of both countries on defense, independent of the G2G interactions, have also continued. So we actually saw in the last few days, L&T and General Atomics signed a deal to co-produce medium altitude, long endurance drones. So I think that the defense and technology side of the relationship in some ways is continuing despite tensions at the high political level in the relationship. The second pillar that I see of the US-India relationship is, developing a viable, mutually advantageous commercial relationship. And here it, definitely is a mixed bag. We are currently, like I said, at 50% tariffs on India, 25% in April, and 25% additional in August because of India's purchases of Russian oil. The goal for, both sides has been for the trade to reach 500 billion by 2030. But we are stuck in this bilateral, trade negotiations. 5 rounds have already happened, but there's been a lot of churn, and by all indications, both sides are saying they're very close, but we haven't seen that happen. And let's remember that both sides did try for a trade deal even in Trump 1.0, but kind of abandoned it at the last minute. And in some ways, some of those hurdles are still around. Agriculture or dairy have been sort of the red line for India, even though it has now agreed to buy some US corn and soybean. So here I think, it's a mixed bag, like I said. I do believe that India will consider going down on Russian oil purchases, and potentially, we will see a deal soon. But if we don't by the end of this year, I do think it'll have spillover into sort of Indian domestic politics. There will be, because there's expected to be an impact on Indian textiles or jewelry sectors, and that can impact the domestic calculations for Indian state elections. And that's really important to the BJP as we see, Bihar now, but Assam and other elections in 2026. And let me come to my last one, but I think this is the most important. The third pillar that I see of the relationship has been the strategic convergence on regional and global issues, right? And the focus on the Indo-Pacific. And this is the area where we've seen the most change, and I think will potentially have the longest implications. So we were talking a bit about, US-Pakistan relations, and here is where I think this factors in. The central thinking in Trump 2.0 is not to let past precedent have too much bearing on the present and the future, right? And in some ways, this works very well if you think about the peace accords in the Middle East. But in some ways, it doesn't work. And where it doesn't work is, the role that Pakistan plays in US-India relations. So I think, Michael was saying this too. On Pakistan, there was pretty much bipartisan consensus in the US over the past, say, 10 years that the relationship is pretty narrowly defined in terms of, counterterrorism, but that broadly the priority partner in the region would be India. But I think what's changed, as at least from Delhi's perspective, is that Trump 2.0 is taking actions that, from Delhi's perception, are very damaging to the US-India relationship. So even though the Trump administration's thinking on Pakistan is probably not, pushed by or driven by grand strategy, it's probably more looking at Islamabad for commercial reasons like critical minerals or narrowly defined roles in the Middle East. But for India, this US engagement of Pakistan and the fact that President Trump actually claimed to mediate the India-Pakistan crisis in May, which is really completely in opposition to one of the central tenets of Indian foreign policy, which is no third-party intervention in bilateral crises. I think that has really sort of solidified distrust of the US and has convinced New Delhi that the US is choosing Pakistan over India. And let me say one last word about China. So we don't know yet what the US national defense strategy is going to look like, what it will outline as priorities, but early reports are suggesting that there will be a heavy focus on, homeland defense in the Western Hemisphere, right? Which is going to leave out Middle East, Europe, but the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific. Now, Defense Secretary Hegseth has said that, there will be a China focus and the US is still concerned about China's military buildup. But if you combine this with sort of the isolationist movement that we're seeing on the right in the United States right now, and you look at the fact that there's a lot of people in and around President Trump that are proposing essentially reduced US involvement abroad, I think there are probably serious questions arising in New Delhi about where and how it can depend on the US to manage China's rise going forward. So, again, like I said, we don't know what's going to be in the NDS, but suppose there is, US thinking at all about redeploying forces from the Indo-Pacific closer to home or concentrating more on the South China Sea or the Pacific more than the Indian Ocean, then I think that will have operational coordination and resource impacts on India. And I think New Delhi will have to think more, about working with countries like the UK, Australia, France to secure its interests. So, in conclusion, what I would say is that the US-India relationship will survive because in some ways India still needs the US and the US still needs India. But I would watch 3 key areas to see where this relationship goes in the next few years. I think the first would be, of course, US foreign policy on Pakistan, and to the extent we see that turning into from the more sort of commercial side to the strategic side. The second would be US-China competition. How does Washington's thinking on Beijing evolve? We've heard the G2 phrase being bandied around, which I think in Delhi has very, very negative connotations. And the third thing I would look at is defense co-development. Where are sort of the grand designs of US and India working together on defense co-development and co-production actually going? Is it because if you actually look at it from President Trump's view, sometimes his focus is on bringing the manufacturing and production of things back to the US. So what does that mean for the Make in India? I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Akriti, and that's a nice segue into what Dinaker is going to be focusing on. Dinaker, you're in New Delhi, but your job for today is to look at sort of U.S. policy for South Asia as a whole. We have Akriti alluding to sort of the Indo-Pacific and the new strategy that's going to come out of the Trump White House that will focus largely on the Western Hemisphere, and if there's going to be any overseas heavy commitment, it's probably going to be in the Western Pacific. So in the light of that, and it seems like there's sort of a bifurcation in the making that Pakistan, we want you to focus in the AOR of US Central Command, and India, we still need you in the Indo-Pacific Command. It's kind of like a division of labor. But anyway, I'll pass the mic on to you. Take it away from here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, RSA, for having me here. And to begin with, the question, Trump's policy on South Asia was actually when I saw the topic for the session, I was like, what is that? And that kind of sums up what is there. As Michael said, there has been no broad policy, so far, kind of announced for the region, and we're actually all awaiting that. With that said, all that's happening, the transactionalism, the way, and everything in between that's happening has an impact on the region, but though kind of everything is in a way boxed between India and Pakistan when it comes to South Asia. So I'll just kind of touch upon each of them, I'll do it in 2 parts. One, I'll kind of flag the broad areas that kind of impact the region, or the policy or no policy, whichever is it. And I'll look at the various other countries. I mean, India and leaving India and AFPAC, where others stand. I'll just kind of broadly, about 5 minutes, I'll do that. So when we say the areas, trade obviously has that kind of is impacting the entire region in various ways, and mostly negatively, because each of them are dependent on the US. Probably South Asia is among the region with the highest tariffs in the current scheme of things. And then immigration and migrant policy, again, the region contributes a lot, so is actually impacted. Climate change or no climate policy, because you have a lot of island nations which literally will submerge, the rate at which things are going. That's a major concern because they are at the receiving end of it. And then, of course, the region is actually mired in a lot of conflicts. You call it conflict, you call it internal disturbance, whichever is the way. All these other economic issues kind of aggravate those fault lines within each country, as we have seen the recent trend of things, Bangladesh, Nepal, across the board. So all of that adds to that. And then the bigger issue of Indo-Pacific policy. So what does it even mean now? Or where is it? How does it stand? So because many of the countries again fall or were important because of the Indo-Pacific policy. So in the lack of a broader policy and in the absence of a specific country-specific approach, because some country is not important in an economic sense or has no trade to offer, no rare earth elements to offer, minerals to offer. So where do they stand? We don't know. I mean, that again kind of adds to the mix. And to top it all is what is Trump's policy towards China? So there's so much said, tariffs imposed. Now it was a U-turn. Tariffs actually brought down lowest tariffs anywhere. And the deal that was made, because then see the compulsion, you need rare earths, China needs chips, but the world needs rare earths, including the US. So the deal made. So in that case, how do other countries kind of find a mid space in between? That's a critical question. So in between, so these are broadly the areas I would like to flag. And one important area is also the free zone aid and the US aid, freeze on aid to individual countries, and that also kind of adds to the dilemma in the region, because all the countries kind of in some way or other get a lot of aid from the US in whatever ways, and it may be minuscule as a number, but for the country it may be actually a big number because in terms of their percentage. So that again kind of is an issue. So on that note, I'll just come to broadly, let's have a quick look at the countries in the region. So starting with Bangladesh. See, Bangladesh is actually curious because it actually raised a lot of concerns in India, because suddenly kind of US did a lot of military exercises, etc. And US plane landed in Chittagong. So all that kind of gave speculations in India. So what that translates to, we do not know. Does it mean more US military involvement, which has actually raised a lot of red flags in India? And there was a lot of speculations, theories going on, nothing substantiated, but you know how speculations work. That's one. Then coming to Nepal, recently, just literally, I think it was in June, the US kind of revoked some protection to the US to Nepalese given after the earthquake. That adds to the trade tariffs because again, the contribution, most of the kind of the trade or the exports are all semi-finished or services. So that kind of plays a very rather dynamic role. In fact, World Bank report actually points to reduction in the growth rate because of the the tariffs in the region. And then I'll quickly go on. 3 countries: Mauritius, Maldives, and Myanmar. Mauritius, not much as a policy, but Chagos Islands is something to look out for, because Trump did kind of the administration did give an okay to UK on the agreement between Chagos, Mauritius, and UK, but just literally a few months later in June, July, there were questions in the US Congress committees raising concerns that ceding Spain or giving away Chagos to Mauritius will allow the PLA China to entrench. So there was actually a concern raised. So we'll have to see how that goes. And Maldives, it figures in the list of possible embassy closures that was recently came out in the media, just not too long back, about 10 embassies, 17 consulates. Maldives figures in the list. So again, given the dynamic between how things have played out, India, China, kind of the tussle that has played out, US in a way in the past standing with India, to keep its foothold. That's again a question of how things will pan out. And lastly, Myanmar. Right? Surprisingly, Trump administration, with all that was going in Myanmar, they removed some of the sanctions on some of the elites just recently, again, a couple of months back. And that raises questions of rare earths. Because why is it important? Myanmar has some of the best rare earths for magnet production. And the kind of rare earth deals you have seen in Pakistan, etc. So there were actually questions. Nothing said so far. So broadly, this is kind of in a way sums up the policy in the region, if I want to call it. But otherwise, we don't have a firm policy, but each of them aggravates, aggravate a lot of fault lines in these countries and more commercial aspects. So, and that has actually also raised questions in India with all these countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Maldives, and Myanmar. So how it plays out, we don't know. We'll have to watch out for it. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dinaker. So after our first initial remarks, I'm going to take the privilege of being the moderator to ask questions. So I'm going to start with Michael. Michael, you said that we don't know where this is going. This is all very new. This is all very fresh. There's sort of a shift in the attitude towards Islamabad, and it seems like more it's like business-like. Um, is it just business, or is it more about the need for Pakistan in the Middle East? And you touched upon that a little bit. And then I'd like you to sort of factor in, the China in all of this. So there is an understanding happening with China because there's so many pieces of this puzzle, and it's difficult to keep track of what's happening where and when. But give us a sense of how that US-Pakistan relationship is evolving, when it comes to what seems to be a US need for Pakistan to play a role in the Middle East. We had the Saudi mutual defense agreement that Pakistan signed. There's talk of Pakistani troops going to Gaza. And then, of course, the Chinese-Pakistani relationship and how the Americans are viewing that.
Yeah, thanks, Kamran, and great comments from the other panelists as well. So yes, I think that the commercial lens is perhaps the strongest lens that this administration is applying toward Pakistan. But absolutely, as I did allude to, I think that we are seeing some readiness on the part of the administration to view Pakistan as a country with strategic importance, in great part because of what is happening in the Middle East. And I think that the geopolitical moment has really benefited Pakistan. I've said before that it's benefiting from its geopolitical moment in the sun. Pakistan, of course, has very good relations with pretty much all the GCC states, and it also has a not as strong of a relationship, but still a decent relationship with Iran. Now, we all know that Pakistan and Iran briefly had a military conflict almost 2 years ago. Even despite that, it's a pretty good relationship, and I think that one could argue that Pakistan is one of the few countries that has a good relationship with China, with Iran, and with Russia. Differing levels of strong there, but still, and I think that's something the administration has noticed. And clearly, the mutual defense pact with the Saudis that you just mentioned, that plays into this as well. So. I would think, as I said before, that, and this is also based on what I've heard US officials say when talking about the relationship with Pakistan, they tend to talk a lot more about critical minerals, energy, investment opportunities than they do about how Pakistan can be helpful in the Middle East. But I do think that so long as we continue to see things in the Middle East play out in the way that they have in recent years, that I do think that there will be that readiness to view Pakistan as a country that shares some things in common with the U.S. And this could actually hurt Pakistan, quite frankly. And this plays into another issue that I didn't really get into, that of Pakistan's willingness to act a certain way toward President Trump that gets his attention in a positive way, i.e., flattery. What I mean here is that Pakistan has agreed to send troops, as I understand it, that not formally. I don't think this has been announced publicly yet, but my understanding is that Pakistan has agreed to send troops to Gaza to participate as part of this stabilization mission with a very small number of other countries. I think that that's something that Pakistan did in order to ensure that its relationship with the Trump administration remains strong. It's very risky for Pakistan politically, and I think it also moves Pakistan closer to a point where it could be asked by the Trump administration to join the Abraham Accords, which would be very risky politically for Pakistan. In terms of the China factor, I think this gets back to what was mentioned before. We don't know what this administration's policy is toward China. It has not been 100% hard line in a way that many might have expected. Clearly, Pakistan's alliance with China, which has faced some troubles, particularly over China's concerns about security conditions in Pakistan. But I think that the degree to which the administration is concerned about Pakistan's relationship with China will really depend on how intense the competition, U.S.-China, how intensive a competition there continues to be between the U.S. And China. But so far what I've heard officials in this administration say about China is what I heard officials in the previous administration say as well, that we can deal with Pakistan having this relationship with China, and that the U.S. wants to provide alternatives, other types of options that might, in due course, succeed in drawing Pakistan away from China to an extent. But I think there's an acceptance that this Pakistan-China alliance is here to stay.
Thank you, Michael. So shifting gears here, Akriti, I was listening to you very intently, and if I'm not wrong, and correct me if I am, your whole sort of synopsis was that the relationship between India and the United States is not what it used to be, and the shift isn't trivial, if I'm maybe allowed to put it that way. So, in the light of those remarks, my question to you is that is there was a special relationship right after 9/11 all the way up until like this administration with India, and it grew. We saw it grow with the civilian nuclear deal under the Bush administration, and that was enhanced under Obama. And then we saw a major sort of engagement under Biden and even under Trump, the Howdy Modi thing and everything. Is it fair to say that that special relationship is not what it used to be, and it's still fun. The US is trying to find sort of the cadence with which it needs to deal with India, and it's struggling to come up with a new framework for a relationship. And it's not just sort of the bilateral relationship, it has to be put into the context of what does US want with China. So if there's going to be an understanding with China, where does that leave India?
Yes, thank you, Kamran. So I think I agree with Michael and Dinaker that we don't know yet. It's a little too early to, write an obituary of the US-India relationship or even kind of the strategic alignment in the relationship, because, you're right that I do think that what's happening in the relationship is not trivial, but I also think there are some kind of structural factors that will bind the two countries together. So I think it will depend on if you kind of look at the Trump administration's, so far as I can tell, their China policy, a lot of what Trump thinks about American primacy is very concentrated on, economic and tech primacy. It's not so undergirded by, strategic congruence or geopolitics or even soft power, right? I think what Dinaker was saying about these sort of benign uses of soft power that we used to see from the US, like institutional building or aid or all of that, that's gone away. So it's a very different way of looking at American primacy and power than we've seen perhaps, in the last few years. It's not about values or the kind of liberal international order kind of framing. It's very much about, you buy American weapons and American technology and you do things that are beneficial to the US, and then we're going to have a good relationship. That is very different from the way that the US-India relationship has been talked about in the last, I want to say, 25 years, right? So I think what we're seeing here is that there is definitely a shift in tone. It's a lot. It's how the relationship had really become so expansive, especially in the Biden years, right? It was sort of, it's this relationship that's on the precipice of, achieving so much greater potential in the Indo-Pacific, versus vis-a-vis the Quad. I think that stuff has toned down, and we are sort of in this. What do we make of what's happened? Because if the fact that we don't have a Quad summit happening this month, which it was supposed to, India was supposed to host it, and most likely it's postponed to early next year. that is a concern. That is a concern about how much stock, the American president or the Trump administration broadly places on the Quad as an instrument of, regional provision of public goods, what it thinks about China. So I do think that, like I said, I do think that India still needs the US on defense and tech, and it seems like some of that is happening more on the kind of bureaucratic and private sector level. But I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag. We have to wait to see whether the trade deal happens. Once the trade deal happens, if it does, does that sort of create a conducive environment for both countries to come back to the table on some other issues? But I think the key takeaway for me is there does need to be a sort of pragmatic reassessment of what are each side's expectations of the other, and where do their strategic alignment and congruences, where do they lie now versus a few years ago?
Thank you, Akriti. Dinaker, you touched upon the various elements of South Asia and how the U.S. has been sort of behaving. You mentioned Nepal, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Maldives, even Mauritius, which is further field out from the Indian Ocean basin. If I were to ask you to sort of zoom out and sort of say, what are sort of the broad contours? So we know that the president keeps talking about it, that he the 87-hour war and his role in bringing that to an end. He is sort of looking at Pakistan in a certain way, which we've all mentioned. What can you discern a strategy? And I know in the beginning you said that you asked the question, what is it? So let me pose that question to you. I know it's a difficult one, but how would you sort of look at it and say, okay, how would you summarize from what we've seen so far? We've yet to see Washington put out something coherent, but can you point to something in the making, if you will?
Okay, so to begin with, the India-US framing, we're talking about the trade, but it's actually, I mean, if you want to say it in one line, it's actually not about a trade issue, it's about a tariff issue. Tariff in Hindi is praise, It's actually, Trump wants praise. It's actually the issue is about not trade, it's about praise. Praise him and the trade deal is done tomorrow. The real issue is probably that. And why? Because if you actually look at May 10th, you talk about the conflict, India-Pakistan conflict, Op Sindoor. May 10th, the real problem begins on May 10th. So till about even in April, even till early May, I mean, despite even after Pahalgam attack, kind of the broad engagement was on, the trade teams were closed. They had a target to reach the deal by August. So everyone was optimistic that they'll even do it before that, There'd been announcement by both leaders in some way, do it, and, so there's real optimism. Despite initial issues, India made significant concessions on agriculture, dairy, etc. Kind of they had a broad metric to work on. But it's really after May 10th, everything literally falls apart. And because India has refused to acknowledge that Trump played a significant role in that ceasefire that was followed. And we have not been able to fix that since. They've come back on the trade, but even if you work out the trade, the real question as I say it is, how do you kind of reach out to Trump and see, how to acknowledge his role and, if not announce a Nobel Prize, nominate him for the Nobel Prize, at least, balance that out. That probably will be the key in fixing the India-US puzzle in some way. And also, of course, making some investments like so many others have announced, several countries have announced a few $100 billion of deals, investments. When it will happen, how, all that is a matter of, figuring out. But the point is they have done it. So it's a question of how that is worked out. And I think for the region, at least for South Asia broadly, then that will kind of pan out how it will decide the larger policy, whether it be Indo-Pacific, whether it's the larger, balancing the Pakistani thing also. But once the policy with India is fixed, I think because there is definitely larger, long-term strategic depth with India than what Pakistan can give. So how that will pan out will also this will decide how that will kind of shape up. Both may exist, but the point is this has greater heft, greater room to there are so many other strategic interests that align for India and US, that we'll keep as Akriti said, we'll keep the relationship going. You can't just write it off. This is more temporary. And the fact of the matter, again, in her remarks, was all the defense engagements are actually going as it is. We talked about Chagos, but the point is, just literally 2 weeks back, an Indian Navy P-8I was in Diego Garcia for a anti-submarine warfare exercise with US Navy P-8A, and they exercised. So that those engagements are happening as it is. The Malabar is scheduled, quadrilateral in a way, because you have Australia and Japan as well in that. So those engagements are going. So once probably that is fixed, I think even the Quad and the larger engagement will fall in place. And the reason for that optimism is that the first engagement, the multilateral engagement that the Trump administration did, was the Quad foreign ministers meeting, literally 1 day after the administration was sworn in. And some of the things, in fact, probably one of the reasons the administration is quite, in general, happy with the Quad is because they don't have to put money into that. Each one of them puts in money. For example, the IPMDA, Indo-Pacific Maritime Domain Awareness. In fact, I'll actually put that in the center of the region for kind of for understanding. That kind of is supposed to be public good for the region by the Quad, and in that each country is doing in their region. India in the IOR, in the Indo-Pacific, in the Indian Ocean region, Australia in the Pacific, Japan around them, US a little being across the board, multiple places. Each one is supposed to put in money, give public good to the region. Now, if you give information, how do they act? Then you have to equip them, the countries in the region. Then you have to put in, that investment. So essentially, it's kind of benefits the entire region, all the small countries, across the board, across the length and breadth of the region. So in that sense, I think those things will flow once this is kind of fixed. And probably now that, the Trump administration has broadly, managed to do their trade agreements with all the big blocks. And, what investments happen is a different question. But I think that should kind of, stabilize the tempo or the disturbance in the whole trade ecosystem or imbalance, or as they see their prism of, viewing the world. If that happens, I think some amount of stability will definitely come in probably early next year. Let's, put an optimistic note on that.
I appreciate that, Dinaker. Thank you so much. And we're around 12 minutes away from sort of the end of the panel. I want to get to the questions from the gallery. So I'm just going to start with this particular one, which is a general one. And I'll, any one of you can address it one by one. And if all of you want to, that's great. So the question from the gallery is, what do the panelists feel is the most important area of interaction with South Asia for the United States? Economics/trade, military/security, political/diplomatic? That's the question. So I guess the one posing the question is asking, which one is probably at a higher level? Is there like a hierarchy of needs here? Anyone can start.
I guess I can give it a try. I mean, if the question, I don't know if the question is asked in a normative sense or what we're actually seeing in terms of the administration. But I guess first to him the latter, clearly the administration.
It's a bit of both, Michael. It's
I guess it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the easier part is what are we actually seeing, and clearly this administration has identified trade as a core driver of its foreign policy, and we see that half of the SAARC countries were hit with tariffs that were pretty significant, none higher than India's, of course. And I think that's significant for all four of those countries, given that that all of them look to the U.S. as a top export market for key products, or really on the whole for their exports on the whole. And if you look at how the administration has approached South Asia, if there's one commonality, I would argue that trade, tariffs. I mean, that has been the main focus. And I think the most engagement that we've seen between Trump administration officials and interlocutors in countries in the region has been trade talks, right? I think that's very clear. And this is in part because of the unexpected tensions in the U.S.-India relationship. You're not seeing as much high-level engagement on other issues that we might have expected to see. In terms of what would be ideal, I would actually argue the same thing. I mean, clearly there's a lot, you look at markets, you look at the demographics of South Asia, you've got a region that is, pretty much every country, each of the SAARC countries have young populations that are urbanizing. There's a lot of really, significant trade and investment and economic opportunities there. But of course, because of the tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed, it's going to make it very difficult to actually to see those types of possibilities actualize.
I would just add a little to what Michael said. I agree. I think in the short to medium term, definitely like the trade and economics piece of it. And if you just even look at it from the US-India relationship, right? This has been an irritant in the relationship for the longest time, probably like 15, 20 years. In some ways, the strategic and defense cooperation has gone on and has become the anchor of the relationship, even while we've had these sort of, trade, economic, commercial issues keep bubbling up over the years. So I think if you don't solve it now, there is a possibility of this spilling over into the broader relationship and causing distrust, right? But I think in the long term, I would say it is the political and kind of military relationship in the region that's important, because if this is still a stated goal of the US, which is providing alternatives to China, if it's worrying about China's rise and worrying about Chinese influence in the region, then it is really about what kind of humanitarian aid, public provisions, military strategic role that the US is playing in partnership with India and other countries in the region.
Dinaker?
Just to add very quickly, I mean, I totally kind of agree with both what Michael and Akriti said. Just to add a bit, one, definitely trade, I don't think there's any doubt in that. One, not just because the Trump administration's focus on trade, but also because that is going to significantly break the economies of all the countries, at some point, if this actually goes on. So the dependency is that, one, the extent of tariffs is unsustainable. They just cannot end their dependency on, say, from the core sectors, fisheries, agriculture, or automobiles, the whole series of sectors. They're just not viable. So they need to work out an arrangement at some point. If that happens, I think things will actually start flowing. And one bit on the military part of it, because at some point it has to go to the security aspect of it. Just because the extent of Chinese militarization. I mean, while we are actually, for the last, say, 1 year, we've been the world is caught up on trade. China has been quietly crossing threshold in terms of its military, what do you call, unveilings, if you want to call it, whether it is its parade or it's unveiling its fighter aircraft or its expansion in the Indian Ocean region, submarines, just recently. And it's actually real threats to the AUKUS that came in the last, few days over the base that's going to come up. So all that, you will have to come back, you will suddenly wake up and realize, oh, we have missed this, because you are focused elsewhere. That realization will dawn upon. I don't think you can miss it. You can delay it, but it's inevitable. So I think we'll have to come back to that at some point.
Thank you, guys. So there was another question that kind of disappeared, but I think I remember what it was. So from one of the viewers, William Crawley, he had a couple of questions. One was about, and this is more about domestic politics. I know we're talking more geopolitics here, but it's an interesting question. He's asking, what do you think are the lessons that Modi is trying to draw from Trumpism in the United States in terms of his own domestic politics? Is there something that, because clearly the Prime Minister of India is under some degree of pressure, given the shift in the U.S.-India relationship, it's affecting him domestically. So is he learning some lessons? So that's one question. And the second question, please quickly do this because we're running out of time. I do want to get one more question after this. The question is that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, India and Pakistan are both part of it. Now, they don't sort of engage one another on that platform. Nothing that, at least I've seen visibly, but if you guys have seen something, it'd be interesting to bring up. So what weight do you give to sort of India-Pakistan relationship in the context of the SCO? Anybody? This isn't directed
I'll just add very, very quickly. See, the political lessons for Modi, probably one, I would just say, I'll leave it at one, would be one is what India has been, rather quiet, what said, what not said. And India did not buckle, as some had described it. But that said, it has exposed your dependencies in some way. One, you can't decouple so easily, It's easier. There have been calls saying, "Oh, do away with that. Let's do let's walk away or break break some of the dependencies." But it's just not easy. So while there's optimism, you'll work out a deal, and all that's a different part of it. But the reality is, over the years, India has invested. Both countries have invested in each other. So the dependencies remain, and probably they're both a liability and also a good thing because they'll anchor your relationship. So I don't know what political lessons it draws, because how do you convey that to the public? Because that's actually what we see here. Because there is a certain reaction saying, "Oh, we will tell the US, you can show it." But the point is, you can't do it. But then how do you convey that to the public? There's a bit of a gap between the two. I don't know how I don't have a clear answer to it, but there's a gap. How do you convey that the real politic to the ground politics? I don't know. There is a bit of a disconnector. I'll leave it there. Just one other quick point: the Shanghai SCO. I'll just make an anecdote here. In all the SCO military exercises where India, Pakistan, and China normally take part and delegate, send troops, tanks, and everything, they always are on different teams. They never exercise together because there are multiple teams, and every single time, because I've been following it for a long time as a defense correspondent, every time we actually go and see where teams are, they're conveniently always are in different teams or different times, or don't come face to face. So that should say a lot without saying.
Yeah.
I'll just say one word on the SEO. I think Delhi's calculus in being in that organization is not really about Pakistan. It's actually about being in the same room when China and Russia are discussing regional issues and having a veto or sort of a voice in there.
Especially Central Asia.
Yeah. So I'm going to give Michael the last word because someone specifically asked Michael a question, and this will be the final question. So Michael, the question is from Abdul Ghani Amin. He says, what factors do you think explain the apparent absence of a clear U.S. policy towards Afghanistan, particularly given the Taliban government's efforts to strengthen relations with China and Russia, who are U.S. adversaries?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, several quick points here. One, the Trump administration does not really have a clear policy toward any country, and I think it takes a very tactical approach to its relations with other countries. Certainly, a lot of it is colored by commercial considerations. That's one point. I'd also say, as I noted before, that the U.S., including the Trump administration, has not recognized the Taliban regime, so that necessarily limits what could be done on policy levels. There are some analysts that have suggested that maybe because he's an unconventional type of leader, that the president might consider recognizing the Taliban. I don't think that's going to happen. And then finally, yeah, the point was made about the geopolitical considerations here. I do not think that Washington, including the Trump administration, views Afghanistan as a battlefield for great power competition. I mean, yeah, we hear a lot about China wanting to do more with the Taliban, Russia. China is not actually that engaged in Afghanistan. It doesn't really have a presence. It wants to invest. It's talked about wanting to, but I think that lingering security concerns have kept it from doing so. Yes, Russia is the one country, the one government, Moscow's the one government that's recognized the Taliban regime, but it's not really that present, right? I mean, you had these engagements and meetings and all that, but I really don't think that this administration sees its interest, its geopolitical interest being impacted deleteriously by the Taliban engaging more with Russia and China, just because there's not all that much happening on a substantive level. Final point, 10-second comment on SCO. I think what really makes SCO significant is that I think it reflects and capitalizes on growing global discontent with the US and Western-led world order, and SCO, like the BRICS, it projects itself as something that's meant to counter these economic models and economic architecture dominated by the West and the US.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the conclusion of this panel. Thank you to everybody who was attending, and thank you to my panelists. Great job, everybody. And the mic is back to Charlie.
Thank you very much. That was very close to 10 seconds, Michael. Pushed it just over. No, thank you very much, Kamran, for moderating, and thank you for all the panelists for joining. I think the discussion sort of just underscores the complexity of US engagement in South Asia, and as all of you said, the lack of policy there. So yeah, thank you for the audience for joining that first session. Now we've got a 15-minute break, and we will come back at 2:30 GMT for our next panel, which will focus on China. So thank you very much.